Has political correctness gone too far? Everywhere we look, something we love from our past is getting canceled. Everything from a part of this complete breakfast to starchy supper sides. From Michael Jackson to Louis C.K., Oompa Loompas to Captain Jack Sparrow. I'm overthinking everything about cancel culture and political correctness. But don't turn this off just yet. I'm going to tell you why cancel culture is one of the most important social movements in recent years. I'll tell you why we need to see cancel culture as an opportunity for personal correction, and how if we don't, cancel culture can turn into a cancer culture. It's pancakes and syrup censorship and saying goodbye to some cornerstones of our nostalgia. And welcome to the podcast. Today, we hear a lot about PC culture or cancel culture. Everyone seems to have an opinion on it. Everyone also seems to have selective amnesia. Or am I the only person to have grown up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s? Have we forgotten that some very terrible things have not only been normalized, but altogether celebrated, encouraged? Things that, by today's modern standards, wouldn't be tolerated on any level. These things were once normal, or even the goal to aspire toward. In interpersonal relationship dynamics, for example, we aren't very far removed from the unga bunga, club 'em by the head and drag 'em by the hair back to the cave days. Those were like the 1950s. To be fair, like I've said before, individual progress, evolution, if you will, is a slow process. Seeds get planted, roots take, and sprout forth slow, methodic growth, only if that growth is fed, watered, nurtured, and exposed to sunlight. Metaphorically, of course. Socially, that change is more like crashing waves, ebbs and flows, and then occasional, more aggressive splashing. The friction we experience in our own spheres, bubbles, echo chambers, communities, whatever. Society experiences those same shifts, but on a much greater level, seismically. One that, when it shifts suddenly, can be traumatic in ways not unlike an earthquake to someone's foundation. Even, for example, in the case of civil rights, where the thing that was granted was the thing that just should have been all along, the changes and disruptions to many people's norms and comfort zones, even if it was something they were fighting for, were significant. Change is, in and of itself, traumatic, even if that change is necessary. Similar to buying a home. It's expensive. There's a lot at stake, but it needs to happen, and you really want it. You should have had this long ago. Now you do. It's exciting, but then you have to paint and move and decorate and unpack. Sometimes I don't think we think about or we forget about that side of progress, the closing costs, the picking of the paint and the wallpaper, the moving, the packing, and the unpacking, again, all metaphorical. But this is the nuance of critical thinking. This is the nuance that helps us understand follow-through thinking, consequences, and the bigger picture. This is also the nuance that, had we accepted this long ago, would have kept many of us from having to question our own past actions, words, or behaviors. My argument is there's no excuse for certain things, but there are reasons for them, some of them, and we can't overcome a problem until we fully understand it. And understanding that many of those reasons can be tied to our social and cultural norms and mores. Well, for a quick brush up on Basic Sociology 101, let's go for definitions, because you know I'm a stickler. Norms are those accepted social behaviors, those things that we're expected to do or are accepted doing, considering our particular culture or society. So in America, our norms are things like shaking hands when you meet someone. It's accepted, and even, it used to be pre-COVID, it's expected that when you meet someone, you shake their hand. It's just good manners, socially accepted understanding of polite greetings. But in some countries, though, your norm may not be shaking hands. The norm there may be to bow or curtsy. Salutations may be in order if your social construct is, say, law enforcement or military. In sports, smack 'em on the ass. Good game, champ. Norms can vary depending on the social construct. Mores are those social or cultural norms that are enforced or justified by some higher moral code. And the easiest way to explain these is norms are sort of those rules we just kind of go with because they're just the things to do, but there isn't really a higher moral right or wrong attached to it. They're just the things we do because they're done, and we all do them, and it seems like the thing to do. You might be rude if you don't shake someone's hand, but in fact, you're just breaking a norm. You're not breaking a rule. Mores are directly tied to right and wrong, things that might be tied to a commandment or a tenet in your religion or faith, but also maybe on a much deeper human level. Thou shalt not lie, steal, kill, etc. Bullying would be one of these, gossiping as well. There are bigger consequences at stakes for the mores than the norms, you could say. So for our previous example of America's socio-cultural norm of handshaking, if shaking hands is socially accepted and expected of us, then think of the mores like washing your hands after using the bathroom. This is especially relevant today post-pandemic, but well, even without viruses, if we'll walk out of the bathroom after doing whatever we need to do to clean, sanitize, or resituate ourselves, and then possibly meet someone and we're expected to shake their hand, then isn't it by some higher moral or ethical calling that we wash our hands so we don't risk passing anything off to someone else? Coughing, sneezing, picking of noses, digging of stuff out of your teeth, all of that could go the same way if potty time's your mental block there. That's just one example, just for shock value. But honestly, you know what, if you're not a post-potty hand washer, I just don't think I want to meet you, just from a distance, you know what I mean? Just don't approach me, just wave. I mean, like, share, and subscribe and all, but touch those buttons on your own device. Norms and mores. Technical scientific terms you should have learned in high school. Many more didn't learn these at all. Now, before we begin to break down why these abstract terms are the big bad blame for all things bothersome and crack into the hypocritical cancer cultism of cancel culture, I'm determined to differentiate and underline the differences. Our mores are our norms built around right and wrong. I mentioned some of the big ones just a few moments ago. The thou shalt nots for Judeo-Christian biblical purposes. But as I explained, these don't have to be religious or even governmental type laws or rules. These can be just those basic human rules I spoke about in Divine Redefined and the Selling Our Souls series. Now, what did I say at the conclusion of the Politics of Dancing series? The hell do you mean you're not taking notes? You're being serious? We're like halfway through the season. You've got to be kidding. I really thought I told you in the very first episode you're supposed to take notes. Maybe I should research how people consume content before I make content. Bygones. Okay, so relating to our point in this segment, my closing argument in the series where I outlined my journey coming out of conservatism and republicanism after disclosing some of the bullying I was subject to in every facet of my life as a child, all of my life, including my religious community, that when, and especially when, the highest standard bearer of our sociocultural norms and mores, if you will, is compromised morally, ethically, when that institution's integrity comes into fluidity, the very foundation of all of our ideals and beliefs, then everything becomes fluid. Maybe you remember the story of the fellow who built his house on a bed of rock and the other who built his house on a bed of sand. Where did I hear that? Aesop? Andy Griffith's show? Was it Tolkien where they hopped? No, they were Oompa Loompas. It's Oompa Loompa lore. I swear to all the over 2,000 gods, it's almost like we were given the answers to the bloody test from the very start, isn't it? If our norms are just things we do as a collective because they're just the things we do because they've always been done and it's just expected of us, and the mores are the hardline right or wrong do's or don'ts of the collective, which are based usually, at least in part, on some sort of religious or supernatural institution, then that institution needs to be, well, as close to perfect as we can get. Or we need to accept that that cannot and should not be a consideration moving forward. As in, we do away with the fairy tales and stick to our collective human best interests, those big do's and don'ts. Here's a recap. Basic human principles from my previous episodes. Don't kill. Don't lie or mislead. Don't steal or take from others. Respect the earth and others. Be generous and give to charity. Seek a simple, humble, and focused existence. In everything we do, seek harmony and balance. Avoid worldly temptations that lead down the path of self-destruction. These are non-religious, apolitical, and practical practices for every human being, aren't they? These cover most of the major make-believes, and they're psychologically and therapy-driven as well. But we as a society have relied on institutions to set the standards for our mores, which sort of dictate our norms. Institutions are far too susceptible to corruption because individuals are susceptible to corruption. Cultism. It's a vicious cycle of misrepresentation. If we would just be taught that any given superstition aside, good and bad are quite simply defined, and the path to a peaceful existence is clearly laid out by all major faiths and early civilizations because of historical trial and error, and all we're doing is trying to improve upon those results and keep testing how awful we can be as a species in the process of pursuing our own perverse perception of pleasure. Cancel culture is an opportunity if we allow it. It's an opportunity to check ourselves, our culture, society as a whole, if we haven't already wrecked ourselves. We can look at this as losing beloved things that actually don't matter to us, like pancake syrup, the preferred gender or sexual preference of a fictional character, or even our favorite entertainer. Or we can have the much bigger discussions about why these things happen. And spoilers, those cancel things, those really bad things, it's only partly because bad people. It's political correctness when one isn't ready to accept that they are toxic and their ideals are toxic, and where those ideals came from are toxic. Most aren't willing to rabbit hole that one. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, wow, I suck. But it's another thing to say, my daddy sucked, my church sucked, everything sucked. However, shifting that lens from PC to PC, political correctness becomes an opportunity for personal correction. This is where it's going to pay off for us in the long run. This is the critical thinking I've been talking about. Being able to step outside of yourself, your culture, and examine the cultism that bred those ideals, just like I've been doing all season long and will continue to do. This has been a long and painful journey for me, a deconstruction years in the making. I don't blame people for not doing it. But then I kind of do, because it's time, you know? No more excuses. From hate-filled MAGA to #MeToo, Black Lives Matter to Back the Blue, our society in America is bursting at the seams with propaganda-pushed half-assed opinions, uneducated ideas, and warped, misinterpreted, and misunderstood traditionalism. This is a knock against both sides, and I believe there are more than two sides here, but we are discussing white nationalist fascism versus everyone else in America and the world. This cultism that's at the core of our culture and the toxicities we've tolerated for way too long. So you might be asking, what exactly gets people canceled? Because there really isn't any rhyme or reason, is there? Canceling is sort of this mathematical equation, which I'll delve into later on. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. Now that we've established some of the very basic foundations of what sets the standards for tolerability in America, let's dig into the question at hand. What is cancel culture? Much of America's cultural history is riddled with scandal, human rights violations, atrocities we couldn't begin to name, and actions that would see America invaded and taken over by America if America weren't already America. In the back half of the 20th century, we saw many minority groups getting more and more empowerment, meaning the establishment had taken a few cracks to the glass. Women with Roe v. Wade in 1973. Recent events notwithstanding. The Civil Rights Act just 9 years earlier. Recent events notwithstanding. And LGBTQ or gay rights back then. Future events notwithstanding. We're seeing slightly more acceptability thanks to members of the community winning political positions along with openly and even some still closeted gay and otherwise diverse celebrities breaking boundaries and tearing down those walls. People were beginning to see this world as the diverse bakery it was, rather than just a store full of loaves of white bread. The children were finally able to see someone like them and feel, maybe for the first time, that they weren't alone in this world, that their dreams might be a reality. And those young people, including all those women, young people of color, and young people figuring out their gender and sexual identities, grew up and got older, and they went off to college. After growing up like I did, hearing the toxicity and vitriol, the slurs, the jokes, the actual comments made out of sincerity straight from the heart, but in a time when those things might be said to one's face instead of hidden behind the safety of the comment section. Those kids, like us, who were going off to college, wanted to learn in environments that were free of that ignorance and bigotry from which they fled. When you see election night maps and the blue cities and red everywhere else, that's a big part of why. In fact, this is a big part of the dumbing down and numbing down of our society. These are the roots of the phrase liberal indoctrination. Why do people encourage their children to go to college and then complain when they get back? What is with the demonization of education in America? Listen closely. College campuses across America struggled to find a balance between open, free speech and creating an open-minded atmosphere where people of all backgrounds and specific labels could feel welcome and comfortable. The lines began to be drawn as potentially offensive forms of speech were discouraged or altogether disallowed. Ideas like Holocaust denial, racism, sexism, and even cruel and hurtful statements intended as humor were banned. Yeah, some college banned picking on your friends. Seriously, the University of Connecticut adopted a rule in 1989 that banned inconsiderate jokes or inappropriately directed laughter that might be considered offensive. Because they saw how hurtful and detrimental boys being boys was, even back then. See Part 4 of the Politics of Dancing series titled The Bully Pulpit. Tying this back to bullying, when many of those college kids returned home to their families and communities, they were met with scorn and ridicule. Not for their knowledge, but because this new environment had become a safe place where certain ideas, phrases, words, and beliefs were discouraged and proven wrong. So when they came back and began trying to re-educate those they cared about with, "You really shouldn't say that. Say this instead," they were challenging traditionalism, and we know the friction of challenging traditionalism. Progress versus tradition. Rather than using that opportunity to learn something new and grow as a person, many of these uneducated folks shut down, got defensive, and turned resentful of the child they sent off to learn in these new environments, to learn all these new things. You know, it turns out they wanted us to learn. They just didn't want us to learn how to be good people or to question them. In the 1980s, political correctness was the rage. We saw more inclusion on television shows. We saw more representation in films. Short Circuit, Soul Man, and Tootsie notwithstanding. And all of that made a lot of people feel very uncomfortable. Political correctness was criticized for being about legislating and regulating politeness and good manners. Free speech critics also slammed the practice. Others challenged that PC hinders the conversations that we need to have, those sensitive and difficult to discuss topics, because we're afraid of saying the wrong thing or looking bad. If we have to tiptoe around a subject, we'll just not talk about it at all, right? In the 90s, this PC culture gave birth to a form of political correctness that stands with us today, and one I think we can all appreciate for all its sometimes awkwardness. Today, we have terms like LGBTQIA+ to represent a wide swath of sexual identification that exists in humans and has since the dawn of humanity, rather than the terms and phrases I grew up with being called. In fact, what was once just gay is now realized as a whole spectrum of queeritudinosity. Then we recognized gay and lesbian because we learned there is a difference. Then we sort of unlocked that bi achievement. We did away with that toxic, well, if you like guys at all, you're gay mentality, and accepted that many people, most I will argue, are attracted to more than just their opposite. Then as we evolved our understanding of the complex psychology and biology of us, we understood more about the trans community and how different that is from just gay as we used to understand it. Questioning queer, intersexual, asexual, our understanding of this is really just in its infancy, because any and all understanding of this aspect of sexuality or human development is all based on lies and mistruths steeped in fairy tales, shame, religious oppression, and suppression. That's why we have to keep adding letters to our alphabet community. We have to. Not to annoy those people that aren't ready to accept that their son might be gay, but because we continue to evolve our understanding of others. In just one area. Today, we may struggle with feeling like it's wrong to say black, but African American doesn't always feel right altogether either. People of color seems too vast, but I don't like calling something someone they aren't, and I know that there's some problematic history here, but as a child, I knew that I'd never seen a black person. Many glorious shades of brown, but never black. Or white for that matter. Piggy pink, as I've said for years, but never white. So those terms bothered me even as a child. They had me questioning things. Why do we call people things they aren't? But today we take more consideration than we used to make sure we're not being offensive and we're trying to address someone or their group by the most sensitive or acceptable phraseology to them. Latinx, for example, over what used to just default to my culture to Mexican, which is fine if you're from Mexico, but not when it's meant as a generalized assumption and you're from Guatemala or anywhere not Mexico. What was Oriental is now Asian, and if we care enough to differentiate between different regions of the Middle East and India and Northern Africa, in saying terms that we learned from 9/11, these horrible offensive terms, if we can drop that, it isn't a lot of change, but it is lowering those bigotry defenses just enough to shoot in an arrow of compassion. It is affecting change, slowly chipping away at those prejudices, those biases, and those preconceived notions. When we stop indoctrinating ourselves, gaslighting our own conscience to lessen other people, we begin seeing them as human beings. And that can be harder than just being a dick. And we still know someone who will slip and say the wrong thing. Maybe we do sometimes. It should be a reminder of the America we never want to go back to. We actually have seen more and more of those people coming out of the woodwork lately. We should show compassion for those who are trying to be better. We should show a lot less tolerance for those who aren't. By the 2000s, with representation and diversity extending beyond just the college campuses across America, but also in our workplaces, churches, social circles, and families, America saw this dynamic shift in empowerment. No longer were those affected alone. Women and men in the workplace began to speak out regarding inappropriate behavior. Minority communities began standing together and standing up to the oppression, little by little. Resistance to this social shift, combined with increasing intolerance for outdated ideals and behaviors gave birth to what we all know as cancel culture in the modern era. Now, the debate over the positive and negative aspects of political correctness, it's still going on today. The debate over cancel culture versus consequence culture rages on social media, with once beloved stars being exposed as monsters. Brands we've all used, revealed as harkening back to our country's racist roots. Books, movies, television shows of an era when America was still figuring out who she was. They're getting disclaimers or ceasing further distribution. The discussion over political correctness is, and always has been, a discussion about the principle of the First Amendment. Not so much about the First Amendment itself. It's about the misunderstanding of that freedom of speech we're guaranteed in America, and that it applies across the board without consequence. Rather, that amendment is a protection for we the people against being silenced by our own government. Nothing more. This discussion is also about how far some are willing to go to prove their point, and who we truly are as a people for what we allow. PC culture, from another perspective, is simply about your own character. How far you're willing to go to accommodate someone when they express that their feelings are hurt. If your initial response was some mockery of hurt feelings or dismissal of those feelings, I'll argue that's why we have political correctness to begin with. We have rules and regulations, mores, if you will, for the sole purpose of regulating our worst of natures, don't we? So if you're complaining about PC culture, there's a pretty good chance PC culture wouldn't exist if you'd stop insisting on selling your soul just to be a selfish, narcissistic, sociopathic dick. Political correctness or personal correction. Your choice, your soul. It really is that simple. Someone's coming to you in earnest and telling you that something you think, say, or believe is hurtful to them. And your first response is, I really don't think they think things all the way through, do you? The political correctness has been ignored or disregarded, mocked and blasted, and thus has festered into cancel culture, which is really just society's way of saying enough is enough, and we're making an example out of this. Think of it like a protest that gets out of hand. All they were doing before was holding signs, and you complained about that. That didn't work, so they shouted and chanted. You complained about that. Didn't work, so they had to be louder and louder until... Well, when somebody's ignored for so long, their choice is either to just ignore the issue, keep taking the abuse, let it go on, or fight back in a way that can't be ignored. The primitive societies might go find a Kevin Spacey and drag him through the streets by horse. Today, we log into our streaming service and just scroll past American Beauty, House of Cards, and that one Superman movie. There are a lot more. That one hurt. Like Cosby. I mean, the list goes on, doesn't it? We'll get to that in a minute. So in our effort to be civilized, we gather evidence, we hold as fair a trial as we can, we publicize and televise that so everyone can form an opinion on it, we prosecute and remove the bad thing, we move on. Whoa there, mule. You're missing a step or two. First off, there's hardly ever a trial for this type of thing. It's usually a court of public opinion. If we do, right, we prosecute. We make sure the offender is offensive. We conclude that beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? Innocent until proven guilty, in most cases. Cancel culture is unique in that it isn't a legal or even an institutional thing. It's simply a collective and united segment of society who agree that consumption of the problematic person or idea should cease. Then institutions get on board. Then streaming systems like Netflix, Hulu, or Disney issue content warnings ahead of problematic content just in case anyone wants to watch the problematic thing. Here's a big 180 for this guy. I oppose Tipper Gore, Al's activist wife, for pushing warning labels and editing and censorship of music and movies at retail stores in the late 80s and early 90s. As a young man, I thought it was fascist bullshit. Years later, a more learned and educated man understands the slippery slope of fascist ideology at play in that, but I also understand psychology, human development, and sociology specifically. The effects of unmonitored consumption of entertainment in young, developing minds, that kind of media. Children, hell, many adults, but specifically children, they can't discern sarcasm. They can use it, they can grasp it clearly, but discerning your words as sarcasm is something the human brain doesn't really get into developing until early adulthood. Maybe, if you're lucky, those late teenage years, but... So as much as it may suck to accept it, if you've ever been sarcastic to a child, ever, there's a high likelihood you've caused some sort of anxiety trauma to that child. Sarcasm to a child is tantamount to gaslighting. You're fucking with their reality, and often we don't let them off the hook because we assume they know it's sarcasm. So we don't just stop to say, "Hey, sport, that might have sounded mean or dismissive, but I was just trying to be funny to myself at the expense of your safety, security, self-esteem, and mental health." Like it or not, that's what it is. And if the human brain develops like that, then imagine what conflicting ideas fed into a young mind. Ideas from toxic music, movies, books, comic, television shows, even cartoons. Imagine what that can do, what seeds of thought those are planting, which roots will take and will sprout forth. What exactly do we expect? I was against censorship. I gave us way too much credit. I mentioned in a previous episode about personal responsibility, and I used the New York soda tax as an example. If you just let people sell 40-ounce sodas, people will just buy 40-ounce sodas. People will just consume 40-ounce sodas, or they'll waste it. If it's consumed, we know what that poison in high doses can do. I didn't understand the complexity of allowing people, individuals, the right to consume whatever they wanted, with no real understanding, education, or awareness of the potential consequences. The consequences of cultism. There's another big step we often miss in the cancel culture process. The discussion. We're so quick to remove the horrendous and offensive thing that we often don't engage in the discussion that needs to happen because we're sidetracked either by details that aren't imperative to the bigger picture, or we simply don't want to have the hard talks. We're quick to snap to judgment and cancel the thing before it wreaks more havoc. Cut the cancer out, throw it away. Except that when we say before it wreaks more havoc, what we sometimes mean is on our fragile realities. The issue is that often we just cancel and move on because we don't engage in that larger discussion. That larger societal discussion of not only that this thing happened, but why this thing happened and what kind of atmosphere could have fostered this thing to have happened. What was normalized for this to happen in the first place, and what can we do individually and as a society to prevent this thing from ever happening again? Now, there are so many conversations that need to happen when a toxic or problematic event occurs on a significant scale that's pop culture relevant. Sadly, people will get more invested and ideologically involved if it's someone they really care about, like an entertainer or sports figure, rather than some bothersome nuisance like a family member, church member, or co-worker, someone they actually know. In this case, we just trade in cancel culture for a cancer culture, one that just eats away at itself until nothing good is left to salvage. This cancer culture where accusations are made and we're more interested in the gladiator sport of reality TV than we are the justice and truth. This cancer culture where we want to turn everything into an either-or pen of this or that. Which side are you on? What's your opinion? You want to hear my opinion? If we aren't careful, if we don't approach these social and cultural speed bumps slowly, deliberately, and methodically, all we'll do is aggravate the underbelly of our metaphorical cultural cars. That underbelly, those who are the most vocal and opinionated, yet least experienced or educated our society has to offer. They're the ones you'll see first with their unfounded and unrealistic opinions on any given issue they're experts in this week. You can point them out because they don't take the time to read, research, or formulate an opinion. It's mostly based on a headline, much less even seeking to disprove that opinion. They just have this opinion, whichever one they're told to have. They'll dictate the conversation. They will dictate the social conversation if we don't. We are the candles in the dark. If the experienced, educated, and emotionally intelligent don't lead the way, we'll get lost in a pitch-black abyss of ideological ignorance. With cancel culture, political correctness versus personal correction, we risk losing our greatest opportunity for growth, evolution, and the elimination of toxicity and problematic behavior from our sociocultural spheres, thus ensuring an endless cycle of toxic tirades and flustered feelings. When an event arises, it's our obligation to engage in the awkward but necessary dialogue to combat that festering overgrowth of infectious toxicity. Conversation is the chemotherapy for a cancer culture. Political correctness and even cancel culture are nothing new. This evolution has been churning for many years. It was once politically correct to own a slave, so much so that if you didn't own slaves or servants, you weren't one of the elite. You were lesser than. You may as well have been a slave. But we canceled slavery. Just go with that. Okay, I've already clarified that we didn't in previous episodes. We canceled slavery. We canceled Jim Crow. We canceled a lot of things, or we tried to. We canceled separate bathrooms and entrances and water fountains. We canceled a lot of things, or we tried to. Regardless of where we are with that progress or how long it's taken, from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, we are all much better off. Well, except for a few rich old white people, men. Cancel culture, this canceling of toxic or outdated ideals, forever doing away with them or altering them to be less toxic. Whew, it's hit us where it hurts many times over and on our nostalgia feels. Remember, these are feelings about things that are tied to emotional memories and not things that are practically important in the relevant world. In that, a practice of therapy or stoicism could lead us to no longer finding these abstract, superficial ideas more important than the cost or consequence of enjoying them. I love Willy Wonka, the original with Gene Wilder. I knew it word for word, I do. I own the soundtrack. I sing the soundtrack in public. When it comes to nostalgia, I might have believed Amber Heard at first because of what Johnny Depp did to one of my beloved characters in movies. That I know that's shitty reasoning. I can't swear subconsciously that I wasn't really annoyed at his performance, offended at that atrocious interpretation of my favorite movie, thus maybe dismissive of Johnny Depp to some degree. Admittedly, as a survivor of abusive and narcissistic relationships, that's not funny. I say it just to say that I may have held a grudge deep down for something stupid. I love Johnny Depp's work as a whole. Some roles I can do without, but look, I'm sure he might feel the same way about one of my roles, playing Detective Number 2 on any number of true crime shows. Regardless, Johnny Depp is an example of cancel culture. Many formed their opinions in the very publicized and televised trial, and many ate up every single morsel of tea. Gossip for those of us over 20. Many climbed those hills of opinion because a man ought never hit a woman, an indoctrination I certainly had hammered into my head as a young man. So Johnny Depp was guilty before he even started defending himself, which is something a man can never do when accused of something by a woman. I fell into this idea. I didn't care about Amber Heard, nor could I tell you anything she was in before Aquaman. Honestly, I didn't even know who she was. She reminded me of a woman I dated of questionable mental stability when I was younger, another when I married, so I was kind of just like, I should have seen warning signs, red flags, right? I went through a lot of the similar things that Johnny went through. I too had to defend myself from physical attacks. I too had to decide between detaining, restraining an out-of-control woman I cared about who sought to harm me and my child and not physically engaging her because all she had to do was tell the cops I started it or I hit her. Didn't matter how badly I was beaten. Still, this indoctrination of a cultural mores, men don't ever hit women, was ingrained into me to the point that when I looked into the mirror at my own battered, bruised, and scratched up self, I didn't see a victim. Whatever I saw made me rather die than tell anybody. So as more details came out, many people switched teams. Team Johnny, Team Amber, because that's what we do in America. Everything is reality television. Everything's a team. Go watch my episode Pen Pals. We're desperate to be herded into a pen, I tell you. That was just one example in recent years, but there have been so many. From Louis C.K., Aziz Ansari, Tiffany Haddish, and even me. I'm not immune. I just haven't done anything that warrants canceling yet. No, I don't mean I haven't done anything cancelable. I mean, I haven't done anything to become famous enough, I'd have to be famous enough to get canceled. That's part of cancel culture math. I'll get into it in a bit. You gotta matter first to not matter anymore. We can't take you down if you aren't up. That's what we do in America. We build them up just to tear them down. But the issue is we kind of build them up on a problematic pedestal to begin with. All of those norms and mores, these things that are socially acceptable at the time, become the foundations of our ideas. In comedy, I've gone low to get a laugh. I've mocked and made fun of just about everyone, every group, and everything you can imagine. And if you're challenging yourself, surely he's never joked about that. You're probably wrong. I've pushed and crossed lines on purpose, knowing good and well what I was saying most of the time. Honestly, most of those things I just didn't see as wrong because I didn't believe them. At least joking about them anyway wasn't wrong. I've discussed some of my reasonings before in previous episodes. Now, I'm not suggesting that Louis C.K. is an angel. Clearly, the guy's a scumbag. But I'm not defending him or his actions. I am saying that it's possible to grow up in America and come to believe that some sort of behavior isn't altogether wrong, that it is wrong and we know it's wrong. But if you're already a bad person and if you're looking for validation for that bad personness, then you'll find it. If you've grown up and existed in this bubble of toxicity with little corrective measures, then surprise if you think women want to be lured to your dressing room for a pop goes the weasel surprise they didn't consent to getting jacked out of the box. How could this have been different? Well, Louis C.K. could have really opened up and took personal responsibility for his perversions. That's hard to do on a public stage, but an apology would have at least been warranted. What fans were handed instead was a half-hearted, barely acknowledgement of problematic behavior. Former fans, I guess I should say. Rather than laying low and letting the dust settle, so to speak, the comedian jumped right back out there, doing a pop-up show to shake the rust off. The issue is no one came to see Louis C.K. at that comedy show. He wasn't billed on the show. He just showed up, asked if he could go on, and they let him on because he's Louis C.K. Right. So he forced his ideas, opinions, and rhetoric onto a group of people against their consent. In fact, those people had been lured to this comedy club under the pretense of not seeing him. And then he just whips himself out and starts spitting his ha-ha all over everybody against their will. Comedy without consent. He didn't seem to get what he had done in that instance. And it was just the same toxic mentality he still didn't seem to realize. Still, he didn't lose all his fans. Aziz Ansari went through cancel culture in recent years just as his Netflix show was taken off. In what amounts to poor communication, problematic expectations, and a really bad date, Aziz was accused of toxic, problematic behavior. In fact, he was accused of not acknowledging or listening to a woman's indications that she wasn't interested in things going sexual. poor communication. Don't assume by her. Communication is receiving as well. Sometimes we don't hear what we don't want to hear. I'm not saying that was Aziz, but we know that can be the case with some people, maybe ourselves in certain situations. The problematic expectations came any number of steps along the way on that date. I can't say I wasn't there. It's just to say that as it ended up, according to the story, at least one person's expectations were at play. Aziz laid low, reflected, did some hard work, it seemed. He came out about a year later and did a pop-up stand-up set where he addressed the allegations, and he said that it hit him really hard. He said he felt terrible that someone felt that way about spending time with him, that by every indication he had in the moment, it was consensual. Now, stopping there, that does sound a little problematic, less like an apology and more like a claim that he didn't do anything really all that wrong. Aziz didn't stop there. I made the comment after 2016 that I never dreamed I could run for office because of, screw the closet, my burial ground of skeletons. I said, I know what I've done, right? And I know what I haven't done, right? From my perspective. And that's a really hard thing to consider. Aziz echoed a similar sentiment. It was with reflection and the hope that his embarrassment would spark a bigger conversation. Just like Dan Harmon, creator of the show Community as well as Rick and Morty. Dan was called out on Twitter a few years ago for harassing a writer while they were working on the show Community. Megan Gans had the courage to speak up publicly, and Harmon raised her that courage with a little surprising humility. Not for Harmon, but for society. Harmon's revelation on his podcast was that he did it by not thinking about it. And he got away with it by not thinking about it. And he said he still would have never reflected on it had she not brought it to his attention. And he was grateful she did, because now he's been thinking about it. I thought that was incredibly powerful. It speaks to the privilege and daftness of how men are brought up sexually in this society. We are taught to pursue, to hunt. We are apex predators. Okay, so bad choice of words. Still, men in America, societal standards, especially pop culture, are expected to pursue their interests, especially if that interest is a she. To what lengths will we go to trap our there has to be a better comparison. Remember Weird Science when two nerds couldn't get laid, so they created Kelly LeBrock out of a collage of catalog clippings so they could shower with her in their underwear? Remember Saved by the Bell? What Slater and Zach wouldn't do to woo Kelly Kapowski? Remember Revenge of the Nerds? When the nerd fell in love with the cheerleader, so they hid cameras to catch the girls changing and being naked, because there was no way those girls would ever get naked and let those boys see by choice, so the boys just took that choice away. Or that by the end of that movie, the girl was manipulated, lied to, misled, and lured into the dark to have blindfolded sex with someone who wasn't her boyfriend. And nobody was charged. Remember that show about the morning news program where the ladies wouldn't sleep with the big star anchor, so he had that electronic door lock wired into his desk so he could trap the staffers in with no escape? That wasn't fiction. That was the Today Show. That was Matt Lauer, who's done nothing with his cancel culture experience except stay in hiding. I bookended with two examples of the wrong way to handle accusations because maybe the accusations against Louis C.K. and Matt Lauer are so heinous there's no coming back from them, while maybe Aziz Ansari and Dan Harmon are still allowed to pursue successes because their accusations weren't as bad, or is it in how they handled it? It's an algebra equation no one understands. A big chunk of it has to do with are you dead or alive, it seems. How much time has passed since the offense? How credible are the allegations? Maybe that matters legally, but in the court of public opinion, it matters a lot less. How heinous the offense plays into it, certainly. How famous you are, how successful, or how influential has a lot to do with it. Now, maybe that's to take down and punish people. Maybe that's because of positions of influence or power like that enable abusers to prey on more victims. That's why you see someone achieve a little bit of notoriety and then the accusations hit. It isn't that Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh wasn't always a toxic alcoholic, womanizing hypocrite. He's always been a piece of shit as a human being, it seems. It's that rising to this promotion and that promotion doesn't raise alarms for people who have tried to forget the abuses and trauma they experienced. However, when someone stands to rise to one of the most powerful positions in the land, well, keeping quiet seems costly. Same with all of the 40-something allegations of sexual assault and misconduct against former President Trump. It isn't always that people just make things up to jump on a bandwagon. It's that one person speaking up empowers others, gives them power, and makes them feel less alone in the very public and very dirty fight. Sometimes, though, people do lie or misrepresent facts, events, or even rely too much on their perspective rather than pragmatism in reflecting on events. Sometimes, some people do want to be on a bandwagon, included in any activism they can find. Histrionic and problematic in their own right, sometimes these people do make accusations to deliberately harm someone else's reputation. Sometimes these people don't even understand that they're doing it because, by their perspective, they're the victims. These are case-by-case examples of moments where very few people know the truth, and it's in everyone's best interest that we vet and validate claims. Truth. Now, isn't that fluid? My side, your side, and the truth. And that's to say, my perspective of the events as they unfolded, your perspective of those same events as they unfolded, then the actual impartiality of the events just as they did unfold, which no one may know clearly. And then the events as they recounted and reflected upon in the moments, hours, days, weeks, months, and years after. And all of those can be clouded or cleared with time and circumstance. Trauma certainly affects things. This is why it's imperative that we as a society create an atmosphere where we are all free to speak up, one that supports victims and doesn't shame or bully accusers. We also need to balance that power of personal responsibility with an atmosphere that eliminates toxicity, promotes therapy, mental health, and one that protects people, all people in the process, until such findings are final. Utopia, huh? That's a gamble. Climbing those hills of opinion. We might just die on those hills, or our integrity and credibility might. If you stood with Louis C.K. because he was one of your favorite comedians, maybe you feel good about yourself because you gave him benefit of doubt. If you're still with Louis C.K., I think you shouldn't get your feathers ruffled if good people still ask why. Fill in the blank with whomever's canceled. Maybe, like me, you jumped too soon to condemn Johnny Depp, or maybe you judged another accused person very harshly only to find out the accusations didn't hold water, or that they were completely fabricated. Maybe you gave too much benefit of doubt to someone who was toxic. Don't be so quick to take a stand that you completely fall over on your face. Since we started talking about this segment with Johnny Depp and Willy Wonka, let me close out and overthink that children's classic for you. Cancel culture has taken many forms. Sometimes we must do away with the thing altogether. Other times we can acknowledge the problematic parts of the thing and seek only to remove those. Most of us grew up on brands like Aunt Jemima pancakes and syrup, Uncle Ben's rice. Most of us grew up seeing the branding and characters on the packaging, but maybe never really thought to connect them with America's shameful original sin. Why? Privilege. Just like Dan Harmon said, I did it because I wasn't thinking about it. Got away with it because I didn't think about it. Many had a lot of opinions when those brands finally saw the error of their greedy and exploitive ways, and then changed their imagery. Gone forever is Aunt Jemima. That brand no longer exists. Neither does the character. if you're thinking that she does, you're seeing Mrs. Butterworth. Still offensive and problematic, but only to those filled with syrup, apparently. The product is still intact. In fact, the taste or nostalgia tied to this product didn't change at all. Just the packaging, the mascot, which often change for products ever so often anyway. It's just that this time it was a big deal. It was a big deal because many humans who were exploited by such imagery finally had one of those toxic, problematic societal norms eliminated. That drove a lot of people into a frothing at the mouth reaction. A lot of people who still like to cling to these racist images for whatever reason. What comes of this canceling? Eventually, using Aunt Jemima as an anti-black slur will fade away. It is, if you didn't know. At least in toxic white Southern culture, it's a slur. It isn't pop culture relevant any longer. In time, that punchline won't have any meaning. Some racists will call someone Aunt Jemima or denigrate something black with more of that Aunt Jemima bullshit or whatever they say, and they won't be cool or funny because everyone will look at them and say, "Who is your Aunt Jo whatever, and why are you so angry at her?" The imagery is gone, yet you can still buy Aunt Jemima products. It's just called Pearl Mill or something now, with a picture of like a mill instead of a slave. The machine to do the work replaced the blood of the slaves. Speaking of slaves, the Oompa Loompas were originally African pygmies. In the earliest iterations of the book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, on which the classic 70s iconic film Willy Wonka was based, the charming, harmonious little helpers were originally African. If you're looking for a visual reference, you may want to look at some of those offensive images from one of the Seuss books that aren't being printed anymore. Those weren't flattering depictions of human beings. And seeing the changing tides of society upon later publications, the Oompa Loompas were altered to having white skin and golden hair. Of course, we get the Trump-stained green-haired movie versions too. One might try to brand Roald Dahl a racist because of this, but I assure you there's plenty of other reasons one might consider Roald Dahl problematic. He certainly held some toxic views, opinions, and ideals, racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic, terrible views of other human beings. His works were doctored by publishers to water down his views, in much similar ways the Seuss folk have done in recent years with Theodore Geisel's works and the way the First Council at Nicaea watered down the Bible. Another little tidbit you might not have known about one of my all-time favorite films: Charlie Bucket was originally conceived as a black character. A black Charlie wins the chocolate factory run on pygmy slaves. That's a much different book and probably not for children. We've seen cancel culture for as long as civilized society has been a thing. So long as societal norms and mores have existed, cancel culture has been right there alongside it. When people push past these norms and mores for too long, that kind of friction is met with great resistance. Resistance that can be felt in social blowback. Just like making the African slaves legally people caused some really angry conservative racists to start hate groups and terrorize and punish the newly freed slaves, terrible people pushing the boundaries of a society and getting away with it for so long will cause some of those entitled narcissistic sociopaths to act out. That can't stop us from evolving. That's going to happen either way, whether we evolve or stay stagnant. Terrible human beings will be terrible human beings until we educate them out of it, or exile the uncurable. Growing pains of a society stretching beyond its comfort zones of oppression, privilege, and problematic toxicity. Cancel culture is a much bigger collective idea, but the core rests within we the people as individuals. What will we the people allow? What are we the people tolerant of? What ideals do we the people prioritize? What do we the people hold holy, sacrosanct, sacred? You see, all cancel culture is brain chemistry. Once awareness takes hold, then your brain doesn't release as many feel-good chemicals when stimulated with the particular thing. So you stop feeling as much joy or ecstasy for the thing when you partake in it. Those brain chemicals can often override our better judgment. Adrenaline rush, things of that nature. So when those chemicals aren't flooding our system with feel-goods, we have more resources to think about the thing and then remember that the person who did the thing we really liked was a scumbag. To other people, then we feel bad about the thing that used to make us feel good. Of course, that is only if our brain is properly trained for empathy. Do we, the people, prioritize the well-being and safety of children while jamming out to Billie Jean? Clearly, Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis were okay, examples after examples of things that have eked under society's ever-lowering limbo bar of cultural standards, norms, and mores. The mores set the norms most of the time. The mores, when corrupted, dictate the corrupted norms. It's the personal, individual compromises of character that determine those standards, though. Institutions only enforce those standards. We, the people, set the standards for ourselves, our families, our communities, our society. Or we don't. Coming up, I'm taking a look at how overwhelmed we all are and why we probably don't think about all the toxic and problematic things we've done and maybe still do because of all the various roles we assume and how we prioritize them. We're too busy to think. I'm offering a slightly different perspective on how we view ourselves, our priorities, and the problems that come when we overload and overwhelm our little brains. I'm comparing us all to that throwaway piece of furniture you barely use, even if you still have one at all. We're going to look at all the hats we wear, why we wear them, and where we stack them on our human hat rack. So catch up on past episodes of Overthinking Everything as I deconstruct a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my original music under my Sir Talks a Lot handle. It's in a playlist for you, all my TikToks and everything else, all perfectly categorized. Follow me on TikTok, like, share, and subscribe to this channel and do all the things I need you to do. And if you like the series, consider a donation to Cash App. Check out my swag store. Subscribe on Patreon. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.